Thank you for that very generous introduction, Elena. And I want to thank both Lauren and Elena for convening this conference and all the organizational work that's gone into it. It's already, I think, clear just how rich the papers are, and hopefully I'm not the only one who's seeing the connections between the different talks emerge. We started the day, so it's been a long day, and we started it with another paper on Gabrielle Souchon by Sandrine. And I hope, and so maybe it's fitting that we end the day with another paper on Gabrielle Souchon. And I think you'll see there's a lot of connection between both Sandrine's talk and my talk, but they're not identical. And I think hopefully it'll be an interesting discussion given that you've already had some exposure to Souchon earlier. I said before the talk also that this might be the audience in which that has the most number of people who've actually read Souchon ever. And I mean that not just from my own personal experience, but I think it's very rare you get a room with at least 3 other people who've actually read substantial amounts of Souchon. There might even be more than 3. So we're making progress, I think, which is great. Okay, so if you could move it. So one thing, there are nonetheless some people who have not read Souchon, and so I just wanted to throw up a slide with a tiny bit about her life and her work. She had a relatively long life for the 17th century, but her publications all come near the end of her life. And I'm going to only be talking about her first work, published in 1693, which has a very long and descriptive title, Traité de la morale et de la politique, divisé en 3 parties, savoir, la liberté, la science et l'autorité, où l'on voit que les personnes du sexe, pour en être privées, ne laissent pas d'avoir une capacité naturelle qui les en peut rendre participants. Nice to put your thesis in your title. Sandrine talked a bit this morning about that work, but also du célibat volontaire, and in the Q&A she mentioned the Petit Traité, whose title I won't read, that's tacked on to the end of the huge traité. And just so you know, it's about an 800-page work. So it is the Traité de la morale et de la politique, and the du célibat volontaire is not a short work either, though not quite as long. So it perhaps is not surprising that the modern edition in English is not complete as a translation, but it's a pretty good translation. It's over a decade old now, and I think there wasn't really any scholarship on Souchon when the translation came out. And so perhaps things that are omitted from the translation we could all benefit from. And I've noted here 2 contemporary French editions. They are both abrégés, so they're also incomplete. There is no modern complete edition of any of her works. All right, so let me now begin. In the Treatise on Ethics and Politics, Gabrielle Souchon argues that women have been deprived of fully realizing their nature as human beings. Women are constrained and so deprived of their natural freedom. Women are kept in ignorance and so deprived of their natural capacity for knowledge. And women are legally dependent on others and so deprived of their natural political authority. And this is from, I think, the 2nd paragraph of the work, maybe the 3rd. The constraint, ignorance, and dependence in which persons of the sex spend their lives encompass all the hardships that make them inferior to men. For being denied freedom, knowledge, and authority, they do not partake of the greatest advantages we can gain from politics and ethics. Moreover, this deprivation is so entrenched that women think their situation reflects their nature rather than distorts it. Souchon's stated goal in writing the treatise is to address this fundamental error in women's self-conception. A treatise on these three subjects is as necessary and useful as it is arduous and delicate, because the majority of women imagine that constraint, ignorance, and subjugation are so natural to their sex that their suffering can never be remedied. Some women interpret these limitations in such an unsophisticated way that their naivete demeans them as much as the laws and customs established to their detriment. So in this paper, I want to focus only on one part of her thesis, Souchon's account of knowledge and ignorance. On the face of it, her account of knowledge does not seem to afford a connection to particular individual interests of women. She begins by defining knowledge, along with the logicians, as nothing other than certain and evident understanding of the individual and particular causes of things. However, she also recognizes that many women are content not to have knowledge, that is, to remain in a state of ignorance, and not only exhibit vices like vanity and greed, but also envy, through which they are always ready to cut down those who strive to rise up from grimy ignorance and stupidity. Why should a lack of understanding of causes of things be correlated with vicious and antisocial behavior? Why should being content to rest ignorant lead to women undermining one another? And conversely, why should an effort to understand causes contribute not only to virtue, but a kind of social solidarity of women in particular? Slide. In this paper, I'm hoping to address these questions. I begin by setting out Souchon's own definition of science, the term that is translated as knowledge. And for her, knowledge involves not simply an apprehension of causes, but also a recognition of a divine causal order. Knowledge not only brings us closer to God, the desire for knowledge, according to Souchon, gives us rules for practice. These rules for practice engender habits of mind, of connecting things with one another, that is, of understanding the causes of things, in an array of different ways, but also a set of intellectual habits, including habits of memory and of will, but also a disposition to fairness or a proper assessment of the relative value of things. Souchon suggests that a failure to cultivate these intellectual habits results in vicious behavior and even dispositions that undermine the social fabric. Cultivation of these intellectual habits, on the other hand, align with the cultivation of virtue, but it does more. Ultimately, it will affect a solidarity with others who are aiming to shake off the yoke of ignorance and to change the customs that have undermined women's epistemic authority. So I'm going to conclude with some thoughts about how this reading of Souchon aligns with her own presentation of her aims in this work. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So I will say I've got the question kind of clear in my head. What I don't have is the answer, Souchon's answers to the questions clear in my head, or because it is, Souchon's not she's a clear writer, but I wouldn't say she's a tight, she doesn't write, it is an 800-page work. Let's just put it that way. So trying to figure out what exactly the argument is it's sometimes elusive. So first, what is knowledge for Souchon? So part 2 of the Treatise on Ethics and Politics concerns the privation of knowledge, or science, and in its first chapters, Souchon sets out to define science and thereby provide the framework for what follows. She is very systematic. The English translation, as I just mentioned, of science as knowledge is surely the best, and it aligns with what we contemporary readers of early modern philosophy think of as systematic knowledge. For Descartes, for instance, proper knowledge is grounded on understanding of first principles, from which a method for ensuring true beliefs is derived. Spinoza builds a system from a set of definitions and axioms that is meant to articulate, and so to represent knowledge of, the order of nature. Souchon's aim, however, so you get in, it starts with a discussion of the definition of knowledge. You think she's going to give you some epistemology. Nope, sorry. Sorry. Her name is not to build a system of knowledge, but rather to demonstrate that women have been deprived of systematic knowledge. And as Souchon notes in the general preface to the work, to be deprived of something presupposes that one is entitled to it or has it in virtue of one's nature. But what could it mean to say that systematic knowledge is part of one's nature and that one is entitled to it? Souchon seems to understand the peculiarity of this claim, for she begins by situating science in a family of epistemic concepts that include wisdom and intellect. Wisdom is a gift that illuminates the divine, and is often taken to be those transcendent and metaphysical visions surpassing the senses and commerce with sensible beings. Intellect instructs us in the primary notions, which without much reasoning allows us to know simple and natural truths. And the understanding that each of these affords is universal, whereas knowledge, or science, is nothing other than the evident and certain understanding, connaissance, of things by their proper and particular causes. After situating knowledge in this way, Souchon concedes that, practically speaking, we know most things by their effects rather than their causes. While we can have certain knowledge of the first cause, namely God, most of what else we know is uncertain and based on conjecture rather than complete evidence. So on this definition of knowledge, we do not know much. Yet, rather than entertaining skepticism, Souchon asserts a natural desire for knowledge. And it's one of the questions that I have is whether this assertion of a natural desire for knowledge is supposed to include in it an answer to skepticism. She doesn't really dwell on skepticism at all, so one would have to, elaborate an argument for her. But it's interesting that she just isn't interested in skepticism as a feature given the period she's writing in. Instead, just goes straight to a natural desire for knowledge. Our intellect has a purpose to seek the knowledge of things, and not to employ our lights to seek that knowledge is to extinguish the fire that glows in our soul. On her account, the most important dimension of knowledge is not the output, the true claims about the world, but rather the activity that results in those outputs. It's through the search for knowledge that we satisfy our natural desire. While in this passage she aligns our natural desire for knowledge with the intellect, the objects of this desire are all we strive to know, from the universal truths grasped by the intellect to the particulars of effects and their causes. So knowledge is concerned with an infinite number of subjects, such that it is both diffuse and extensive, and includes not just general and universal knowledge, but also of particulars. So that we may not know many things with certainty, because we have a natural desire to seek knowledge of everything, we develop a disposition to understand things by understanding their causes. And this is the definition of knowledge that Souchon settles on. Knowledge is a habit that's formed within us by the practice of reasoning, which draws its lights from the sight and experience of diverse subjects that are communicated to the mind by the means of the senses. If the core of knowledge is a desire to seek the truth, it makes sense to conceive of knowledge as a habit, for desires require direction and regulation. That is, they need to be harnessed to realize their full potential as virtues. Next slide, please. I want to highlight 3 additional points from Souchon's initial definition of knowledge. First, for her, knowledge requires work. In a prelapsarian state of innocence, human beings simply through contemplation possess knowledge of both divine and human truths that contributed to our happiness without having to work to achieve them. Somebody this morning asked about whether she had some thoughts about the fall, and this is it, so far as I know. In a state of sin, knowledge, that is science, la science, is opposed to all disorders. It uncovers objects and lifts the veil from them so that we will not be mistaken. Yet, unlike in a state of innocence, it requires work to acquire knowledge, to reveal the nature and causes of things, and that work is endless, given the diversity in the world. But this diversity is matched by the extraordinary fecundity of the human mind, which takes pleasure in this diversity, being like a bare slate and a canvas disposed to receive all the images one wants to paint on it. That we need to work to acquire knowledge is not simply a matter of the attention required to cultivate the habits proper to knowledge. It's also a matter of perseverance to overcome the challenges that arise in ascertaining the causes of observed effects. Second, though Souchon subscribes to a kind of innatism, she recognizes that we have a natural desire for knowledge and that our intellect can be illuminated to know God. Even this innate capacity for knowledge is not something that we can access on our own as individuals. Citing Aquinas, she notes that it's impossible for us to ever arrive at the knowledge of divine things without the particular help of grace, which instills in us the habits through which we can penetrate the mysteries of faith. Similarly, she recognizes that we need to work together to acquire knowledge. Though we each desire to seek knowledge of the many diverse objects we encounter, we also each approach objects from diverse perspectives. She writes, one and the same object can produce in the mind of men many and differing pieces of knowledge in accordance with the perspectives in which they can be considered. So a physicist and a metaphysician have distinct conceptions of quantity. A philosopher and a doctor have differing conceptions of the human body. Moralists and politicians have different conceptions of human actions. And philosophers and astrologers see the heavens, suns, and planets differently. Geographers and geometers have different conceptions of extension. All of these perspectives contribute to human knowledge. She's not privileging one of them over the other. She's just laying out the vast diversity of perspectives. So on to the next section. So that's her account of knowledge right there, or at least its definition. I now want to move to talk about something Sandrine mentioned that comes up throughout this second part, but the utility of knowledge and the cultivation of habits. So while Souchon asserts that knowledge involves the apprehension of causes, she does not offer much detail about how we come to understand causes. Instead, and in keeping with her definition of knowledge as a habit, she devotes no fewer than 7 chapters to articulating the utility, its utilité, of human knowledge. So just as an aside, it's very, this text is, I think, very puzzling. Why talk about the utility of knowledge? As will soon become evident, Souchon's sense of utility is not the sense in which Descartes might talk about the utility of knowledge. It's not about how knowledge can serve to make life easier, like building machines that make lifting heavy objects easier, like building a cathedral or something. Or someone after her, Marie Thiroux d'Arconville, has these great chemical experiments of how long it takes food to rot in different climates and circumstance. She's not interested in maximizing the period before milk goes sour, nor is she interested in devising tools to puree soup or something like that. So if that's not the sense of utility, what the question that I'm still not confident I have an answer to is what role are these chapters playing in her argument, right? Why talk about the utility of science? So first and foremost, the pursuit of knowledge of the natural world allows us to come closer to knowing God and the divine. Sandrine talked a bit about this this morning. So striving to understand the causes of things in the natural world first presupposes that there is an order of nature. In striving for knowledge, then, we ought to adopt a method that serves to demonstrate the wonderful order, ordre admirable, the unity, truth, and goodness, three properties of being which give it a relation to its creator. Indeed, she notes, understanding the divine through created things is easier than knowing God directly, because human beings and natural things are more proportional to the scale of our human minds. And just that passage resonated with what Getty was just talking about in Masham as well. In seeking knowledge, then we ought to cultivate dispositions to look around us and to notice connections between things. In noticing these connections, we can extrapolate to a larger order and come to recognize the unity constituting the divine. We can also group connections into kinds. The kinds of connections we make correspond to domains of human knowledge. So for instance, logic helps us understand what is necessary, and so the order of reasoning. That is, distinguishing the true from the false, relating properties to one another to construct arguments and draw consequences, understanding things by definition, separating one part from another, and identifying properties and powers. Natural philosophy affords knowledge of sensible objects, and through this domain of knowledge, we can understand 6 classes of being. And philosophy is critical in giving us rules for practice that support our overcoming the numerous accidents which occur in life. If this way of understanding Souchon is correct, domains of knowledge are distinct habits that reflect differences in what we experience, different ways of approaching what we experience. Souchon asserts next that knowledge enlightens the understanding, but this enlightenment is not simply a matter of the mind acquiring more and more ideas, as if filling up a vase. It's also a matter of how the mind acquires its ideas, that is, about the intellectual habits that are cultivated. So the mind, which is the supreme end of the soul, cannot have a full perfection, but with its intelligence, the fecundity of its productions, the facility of expressing its thoughts. Intellectual and speculative habits are powers and dispositions which serve as the means for acquiring knowledge and filling itself more easily with an infinity of ideas. So what are these intellectual and speculative habits that serve as the means of acquiring knowledge? Next. Souchon highlights memory and will. Insofar as memory has the power to make present things that have vanished, it serves as a vehicle for representation for all the objects we encounter. With the representation of these objects in mind, we note the connections between them. That is, we acquire knowledge. Acquiring knowledge, in turn, ultimately clothes and decorates the memory, as through reflection, reasoning, developing arguments, reading, and repetition, we imprint knowledge in memory. Memory thus both starts the acquisition of knowledge and is critical to our satisfying our natural desire to know more. Memory, however, also affords an inner conversation and the ability to reflect on its many and diverse ideas and the connections that we find between them. This increase in our power of reflection and comparison in turn serves to counter fear and timidity and even uncertainty in asserting one's point of view. Thus, with a robust memory, we become more prudent and even more content. Next. For Souchon, will, so second power, whatever it is, the intellectual and speculative habits. The second one is will. Will is a power that is essentially blind and can do nothing without the understanding, and so the will is guided by knowledge. Now, this is not to say that the will, Souchon takes the will to consist in a freedom without a direction at all. The better part of part 1 of the traité, she argues that the will is created by God to be directed towards the divine and so towards the good. And she reiterates this point here. Nonetheless, though God, insofar as he moves the human will, is the sovereign principle which inclines them to their object, with respect to particular goods, the will determines and makes the choice it pleases on the basis of a good that is either true or apparent and is never able to be carried to evil as evil. Knowledge ought to serve as its rule in just the same way as those artisans use a guide in the production of their works of art. While the will by its nature is directed towards the good, any movement of the will depends on its representation of particular things. These representations can reflect reality better or worse, and so be better or worse guides for action. The process of striving to adduce the causes of observed effects provides us with a measure that can guide our action in the same way that a craftsman uses a guide to produce their works. There's a ton more to be said here. This analogy that's being drawn is it's under-theorized in this paper for sure, under-interpreted in this paper. I think the critical point is that knowledge serves to guide our actions through the ways in which objects in the world are presented to us. Next. Souchon, however, also makes a further point. Knowledge serves to conduct and direct the heart. If by illumination and knowledge that man draws as much from nature as truths of faith, he directs and conducts his heart to the sovereign of all beings, who is God. By reasons of morality and politics, he ought to direct it towards those like him with a reserve and moderation so great that he never rests in affection too biased and too particular. This is not to say that the hearts of men ought to be closed to one another, chasing away this human and natural tenderness that renders them compassionate to misery and friendship. It should be obvious that this passage really resonates with the discussions of friendship that have happened this afternoon. So I'm not lying when I say there's lots of connections in the papers. Souchon recognizes that our actions do not simply concern an understanding of objects in the world, but also concern people. We have a tendency to feel affection for those close to us and who are like us. This tendency, however, reflects only a narrow perspective, one that biases us against those with whom we are not already familiar or who seem different from us. Knowledge, or the habit of seeking the connections between things and ultimately understanding the unity and order of the world, moves us to expand our view outward to take in as much of the whole order as we can. This expansion of our view disposes us to fairness, to minimize the bias with which we act towards individuals, even while we preserve an attitude of compassion. Equally, this disposition to connect things impacts our own internal life. As we encounter the diversity of objects, we're affected in a diversity of ways, and the constant barrage of contradictory emotions leaves us as if on a stormy sea. Knowledge serves to steady our ship. So I'll just, as an aside, ask some interpretive questions. I'm really just trying to get a sense of the big picture of Souchon's view about knowledge. One question that I have is whether there is a connection between these different elements, the grasp of the divine, the intellectual and speculative habits of memory, will, fairness, and the regulation of the passions. It seems to me that Souchon is presenting us with her account of the mind here, but that's not how it's presented to the readers. I'm going to now explain the human mind. So it's really, anyway, it's a bit of a puzzle of how to understand really what the intended argument is. So I started this section with another aside about what Souchon might intend in discussing utility of knowledge. Our desire for knowledge, that is our desire to understand the causes of things, serves to perfect, perfect our intellectual powers by cultivating intellectual habits, and in particular of memory and will, but also our moral sense, our sense of fairness. These very powers are also deployed in our search for knowledge. So our desire for knowledge has a bootstrapping effect. It starts us on a cycle of self-perfection. Next slide, please. All right, so I've just started to articulate Souchon's picture of what she terms the utility of knowledge. Knowledge is both that through which we exercise our rational capacities, but also that through which those rational capacities are developed. Souchon's fundamental thesis is that women, in being deprived of knowledge, are deprived of having their rational capacities flourish. Souchon also thinks that this lack of knowledge results in viciousness. Here's one passage from the foreword of part 2. Women's lack of study is the source of their indulgence in gossip, luxury, flirtatiousness, vanity, and greed. These are the greatest, most common, and most frequent disorders to which women succumb, for most other sins are largely unknown to them. What is more, it seems, being deprived of knowledge leads to a kind of moral inversion, where the very state of ignorance is prized and true understanding is devalued. So this is, again, from part 2, but it resonates with one of the passages I quoted from the general preface to the whole work. These envious minds devote the sum total of their wisdom to condemning what they do not understand, stubbornly claiming it is a virtue to display their indifference and their aversion to intellectual understanding, which remains uncommon and unusual among the sex. Why should being deprived of knowledge or being kept in a state of ignorance lead to this? Surely not having the opportunity to understand things by their causes or to develop habits of reasoning could lead simply to being an average human being, stumbling through life, not really appreciating the reasons one is doing what one is doing. This wouldn't be vicious, but rather in Aristotelian terms, it would be being simply incontinent. And surely one could be simply content with one's lot in life, not desiring to know more, but neither being so resentful of those who do know more, so as to devalue knowledge itself. So why does she think, why does she think being kept in ignorance leads to this vicious behavior? Well, one sort, these sort of vices in women. One sort of answer is, I think, a familiar one. In being deprived of knowledge, an individual is not afforded an understanding of the relations between things, and so is not afforded an appreciation of relative merit. So take vanity, for example. Surely there's a value to taking pleasure in one's achievements, and we merit praise when we succeed in a difficult task, whether it's climbing a tall mountain or solving a logistical challenge or publishing a paper or helping someone in trouble out of their bind. The difference between this pleasure and proper praise and vanity is one of degree. A vain person takes excessive pleasure in their achievements and demands excessive praise from others for those achievements. We can all think of our favorite current affairs examples right now. We might say a vain person overvalues what they have done. That is, they overestimate the degree to which their own actions have caused what they have achieved. Perhaps a Sherpa carried their water supply while they climbed the mountain, or a whole team supported the effort to mount a new academic program, or friends, colleagues, and even journal referees provided comments to improve the paper. Lack of knowledge, that is, an understanding of the causes of things, contributes to their vanity. And without knowledge understood as a habit of reasoning about the causes of things, they will have no disposition to adjust for any errors in their self-assessment. Indeed, since each of us is rarely neutral about our position in the world, without knowledge in both senses, we would be left to our initial impressions and assessments. Suchon sometimes seems to assume this kind of explanation. Referring to women, or rather persons of the sex, which is how she refers to women, she writes, and what is most deplorable is that they have to practice morality without knowing, because they have to fight a war against their passions without understanding their seat, without discerning those which reside in the concupiscible appetite from those dominating in the irascible. They make use of habits without knowing if they are infused or acquired, and practice virtues without knowing they are moral or Christian. So basically she's just saying women do whatever they do without self-knowledge. The persons of the sex, without the aid of science, can well feel the attack, this is a different passage, the attack and tumult of the passions. But without these lights, the lights of the intellect, they do not know how to overcome them, nor to govern their heart, which is the seat and the place where they reside. This story, however, so there's this kind of individualist explanation of why women deprived of knowledge would be also inclined to vices rather than virtues. This story, however, does not seem to me to explain the way in which being kept in a state of ignorance can lead to a kind of moral inversion. That is, to actually value ignorance over knowledge. To address this, I want to draw attention to an easily overlooked dimension of the passages I highlighted at the beginning of this section. The vicious behavior Suchon highlights include not only vanity, but also gossip, luxury, flirtatiousness, and greed, as well as envy. Each of these vices involves interpersonal interactions. We don't gossip or flirt with ourselves, but rather with others. Greed and envy involve desires for what others have, and even luxury involves a display to make our relative wealth visible to others. For Suchon, a lack of knowledge does not simply affect the ignorant individual, it also has social consequences. Instead of conversing about what the most likely cause of the onslaught of grasshoppers, say, for example, a person without good epistemic habits will mock their neighbor's response to the grasshopper inundation. Don't ask me where these examples came from. Instead of saying learning to knit and to read and design patterns for ourselves, a person will want a sweater, learning to knit and read and design patterns for ourselves. A person will simply covet a sweater that somebody else has. Failure to cultivate a disposition to reason causally results not only in failures of moral reasoning at the individual level, but also in fraying of social relationships. Frayed social relationships do not yet get a moral inversion, however. For this view to fit together, Suchon must think something like this. As much as human beings are essentially free, they are also essentially social. We don't live solitary lives, but live with one another and cannot avoid doing so. Frayed social relationships put pressure on that social dimension of humankind. Imagine a whole group of people being kept ignorant. While their misguided dispositions might undermine their social relationships, their social nature could lead them to align their views in a way. People would align to mock the person different than they are, which can then lead to factionalization and the efforts of one group to undermine another. So I think that's perhaps an explanation of the kind of phenomena that she could accept for the phenomena that she describes. I now want to turn to the last section to address the last in the series of questions that I posed about Suchon's discussion of knowledge. Why should an effort to understand causes contribute to virtue and to social solidarity? Well, the benefits to the individual of the pursuit of knowledge are clear. Here's Suchon. There's nothing so distressing that contemplation cannot soften. It weakens what is harsh, refines what is crude, awakens intelligence, brings to light what is most hidden, and revives what is dead and buried. Study has the power to correct even the crudest aspects of a faulty nature, because challenges serve to elevate generous minds nourished by work and by the efforts of study and contemplation that constitute their pleasure. The story of the relation between the pursuit of knowledge and virtue is a familiar one, and I've alluded to it earlier already here. In striving to understand the causes of things, we acquire perspective, and seeing things in their relations to one another tempers our initial passionate responses, inclines us to virtuous behaviors and virtuous habits. I don't want to dwell on that story here, because I'm more interested in how these individual benefits of knowledge should also result in social solidarity. One way to answer this question is to tell a story about the cultivation of individual virtues leads to an alignment of interests in pursuing the truth, for instance, and so the construction and strengthening of social relationships. Recall that Souchon recognizes that knowledge is largely a social activity. I've already highlighted her recognition that collective labor is involved in knowledge. For her, even our innate capacity for divine knowledge requires divine grace to be realized. And the diversity of our perspectives each contributes to a project of understanding the causes of things. Her recognition that acquiring knowledge is a collaborative project aligns with this kind of story of how the desire for knowledge results in social solidarity. I don't think, however, that this is the whole of her story. Souchon has a richer story to tell both about the sociology of knowledge, has a richer story to tell about the sociology of knowledge. First, for her, the sociality of our epistemic endeavors is pervasive. While a search for knowledge is certainly of benefit to us personally, we're not inclined to keep that benefit to ourselves. We want to share what we've come to know with others. So here's Souchon. Just as it is by a natural instinct that human beings are carried to seek things that are hidden, so too by the same motive, they desire to manifest what they know and to express their opinion and their feelings when they think them to conform to reason and to truth. And not only do they share knowledge orally, they commit what they know to print in books that other people can and will read. This publication of knowledge in books is one of the most effective ways to share knowledge with others. Souchon writes, "Of all the means that God has given humans to make them knowledgeable and capable, the love of books is the strongest and the most efficacious." These books, what does this mean about ebooks? I don't know. These books are not simply effective mechanisms of transmission. Their efficacy rests in their capacity to move us. Books kindle our imagination, opening up worlds that extend far beyond our local sphere. And in doing so, they inspire us to want to know more, and then presumably to share that knowledge with others. Reading a book also requires sustained attention and hones the ability to retain in memory what one has read and to anticipate what will follow. That is, books also help us cultivate habits of reasoning at the core of knowledge, even while they convey the knowledge others have acquired. Indeed, Souchon distinguishes three classes of knowledge by their locus of transmission. The first is the most philosophical in philosophical treatments of knowledge in the period. It's knowledge that we arrive at for ourselves in our own minds, of which the most central is knowledge of the divine. The remaining two, however, are intrinsically social. Knowledge in books, just discussed, knowledge in speech, and knowledge in speech, which she characterizes situated in chairs, schools, and disputations, and by which she means the knowledge transmitted through educational institutions and through public presentations like this one. Just as knowledge is transmitted socially, the deprivation of knowledge also has a social dimension. Women are deprived of each of the three avenues for acquiring and expressing knowledge. They are told they are too weak to reflect and study to arrive at knowledge. They are given only the books that serve to educate children, and they are not taught how to write or express themselves, and they are prohibited from speaking publicly. And when they do, men are unwilling to give them an audience. Women are deprived from realizing their natural desire for knowledge, not simply by preventing them as individuals from acquiring knowledge, but also through mechanisms of social exclusion. It's not simply that individual families have decided not to educate their daughters, but that the social norms and customs conspire to keep girls and so women ignorant. And this is really a remarkable passage. It's a bit long, but I'll read the whole thing. Given that power and habit are sufficient to produce their acts and they must be accompanied by operations which perfect them, how is it that persons of the sex who possess this intelligent and spiritual faculty which holds the power to acquire knowledge are deprived of it? If it is not by an excess of hardship which has its source not in their incapacity, but in the injustice of the custom which deprives them of the means necessary for the beautiful pieces of knowledge that serve as food for interactions between all good minds. And as knowledge, sorry, this translation is a bit rough. It is my own, so haven't had time to clean it up. And as knowledge is the most wonderful of all qualities and the greatest of all advantages, it's not surprising that men who have worked so much to grab it want to possess it uniquely, without permitting women to have any part of it. This is only because they cannot abide that they are enlightened if it is not to be the light that they pretend to communicate to them, and not by the light that they can draw from the study of the sciences. In this way, they are deprived of the perfection of which human understanding is capable. Those theys refer to men in some cases and women in others. Further social norms preclude women from sharing any knowledge that they happen to acquire in the public sphere. They can't publish books they might author. They cannot hold chairs or present at disputations. The systematic social exclusion from the epistemic economy creates a vicious circle. Depriving women of knowledge handicaps their development of rational abilities. Their unpracticed memories become weaker, and their will is insufficiently directed. But more significantly, this handicapping leaves them even more dependent on others who do have knowledge and more deferential to the social norms that enforce women's state of ignorance. I think I just did that slide, but leave it there for a second. To break through this truly vicious circle requires not simply that women as individuals are able to act on their natural desire for knowledge. And Sandrine's talk this morning really focused on how to revive that sublimated desire or desire that's become dormant. They also need to recognize, women also need to recognize that their own individual interests are aligned and to work together to shift the social norms that conspire to keep them in a state of ignorance. That is, they need to understand their own nature as intrinsically rational, to recognize in themselves a desire for knowledge, and to be motivated to satisfy that desire. They also need to acknowledge that their very ability to understand in this way and to act on that self-understanding is constrained by social norms. Social norms do not change because of singular efforts, nor do they change because of a constellation of singular efforts. They can only change if women understand themselves as having a shared purpose and coordinate their actions. Okay, next slide. So to conclude, I want to suggest that this coordination of women's efforts is precisely one of Souchon's objectives in writing the treatise. For one, Souchon is writing a book. She's articulating her ideas, she's publishing them, and making them public. She is thus entering into the epistemic economy. And while Souchon originally publishes this work anonymously under the name G.S. Aristophile, she makes a very conscious decision to reveal that she is a woman in the preface to the work. And it goes on for pages, right? Like it's 5 pages of explaining her style and the fact that she's a woman author. And so here's a nice succinct part of that 5 pages of holding forth. After consulting common sense and reason on the matter, I do not hesitate to confess that it is the work of a girl. That way, my mistakes can be more easily excused. Moreover, because I am a girl, this treatise will be helpful to the persons of the sex, for it should be that they can participate in the various fields of knowledge and produce a forceful discourse just as well as men. The work itself is meant to be an exercise in arriving at knowledge. Souchon wants to understand women's nature and at the same time to defend an understanding of women's moral and political situation. She is quite clear that her aim is to empower others, and in particularly women, to acquire knowledge, to come to see themselves in a new way, and to understand the causes of their conditions. While doing that, she is inviting them to develop their rational faculties. The sheer mass of the work challenges the memory and equally evokes a range of emotions from anger to hope. But the arc of the discussion is one that facilitates a feeling of determination, or perhaps hardiesse, je ne sais pas, to disrupt the social order. Her hope is clearly that with this newfound perspective, women will themselves be motivated to continue to pursue knowledge and indeed produce a forceful discourse, to enter into the epistemic economy themselves. In presenting their respective understandings publicly, a community of knowers, one that includes women knowers, will emerge. That these women, or indeed these individuals, share a common purpose need not entail that they all agree. Their coordinated action lies simply in entering into the commerce of ideas, conversing with one another, exchanging their diverse perspectives, and creating the very conditions that allow this new form of commerce to thrive. Thank you.